Night the judge signed the final papers. I drove home to a house that wasn't mine anymore. Sat down on the floor because the furniture was already gone, and I laughed. Not because it was funny, because if I didn't laugh, I was going to break something, and there was nothing left in that house to break except myself. My name doesn't matter for this story, so let's just say I was a 34-year-old man who thought he had built a good life. A house with a paid-off mortgage that we were still paying off. Actually, but a house nonetheless. A car in the driveway that I'd worked 6 years of overtime to afford. A savings account that I checked every single month like it was a scoreboard for how well I was doing as a husband and a provider. And a wife named Renata, who I believed loved me the way I loved her. I was wrong about almost all of it. Here's the part that still makes my stomach turn when I think about it. Renata didn't fall out of love with me over years, the way people usually say happens. It wasn't a slow fade. It was sudden, and it was deliberate, and by the time I found out, she had already spent 8 months planning her exit while I was still planning our future. I found out by accident. The way most people do. I was fixing her laptop because the screen kept flickering, and I needed to back up her files before I took it in for repair. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that, because for a long time afterward I felt guilty, like I had done something wrong by discovering the truth. I hadn't. I was just trying to save her photos. What I found instead was a folder labeled Taxes 2023, which seemed innocent enough until I opened it and realized it wasn't tax documents at all. It was a spreadsheet, a literal spreadsheet, with columns for dates, columns for amounts, and a column labeled Transferred to R2, which I later learned stood for a second account she'd opened under a slightly different version of her name, using her mother's maiden name as a middle name so it wouldn't immediately jump out at me if I ever saw a bank statement. She had been moving money out of our joint accounts for 8 months. Small amounts. $50 here, $200 there. Nothing that would trigger a conversation. Nothing that would make me suspicious if I glanced at her statement. But added up over 8 months, it was almost $11,000 sitting quietly in an account I didn't know existed, attached to a name that was almost but not quite my wife's name. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I had to sit with it for a lot longer than a second. $11,000 doesn't disappear by accident. That's not a woman drifting away from her marriage. That's a woman building an exit ramp, brick by brick, while still sleeping next to me every night, still kissing me goodbye in the morning, still telling me she loved me on our anniversary, which, by the way, fell right in the middle of those 8 months. I didn't confront her right away. I know that probably sounds strange, but I needed to understand what I was actually looking at before I said anything. So for the next 3 weeks, I became someone I never thought I'd be. I checked her phone when she was in the shower. I looked at credit card statements more closely than I ever had. I started noticing things I'd been too trusting, or too tired, or too busy to notice before. The way she'd take calls in the garage instead of the kitchen. The way her phone was always face down on the counter now when it never used to be. The way she'd started going to a new gym that, when I looked it up, was actually just 2 blocks from a hotel where, it turned out, she had checked in 4 times in 6 weeks. If you're watching this and you've been in a similar situation, you already know that sick feeling I'm describing. That moment where your body understands the truth before your mind is ready to accept it. I'd feel it in my chest, this tightness, every time I found one more piece of the puzzle, and each piece made the picture clearer and uglier. The man's name was Desmond. He worked with her 2 falls up in the same building, in a role that had absolutely nothing to do with her department, which made me wonder how they'd even met in the first place. Until I found out he used to be her manager 2 years earlier, before he got promoted and transferred. Old history. Apparently, that had never really ended. It had just gone quiet for a while and then picked back up. I want to pause here and say something, because I think it matters. Before I tell you the rest, if stories like this hit close to home for you, and you want to see how people rebuild after everything falls apart, that's exactly what this channel is about. Hit subscribe if you're still with me, because the second half of this story is where things actually get interesting. And I promise you, it is not what you're expecting. So, 3 weeks of quiet detective work, and I finally had enough. Bank records, screenshots of messages I found backed up on a shared cloud account she'd forgotten I had access to, because I was the one who'd set it up for her 2 years earlier. Hotel confirmation emails that had somehow synced to a tablet we kept in the kitchen for recipes, of all places. I had everything I needed. I didn't yell. I didn't throw anything. I sat her down at our kitchen table on a Tuesday night, put my phone on the table between us, and asked her to explain the spreadsheet. Her face did something I'll never forget. It wasn't shock. Shock would have meant she didn't know I knew. This was something closer to relief. Like a howled breath finally being let out. She looked almost grateful that the pretending was over. I was going to tell you, she said, which is one of those sentences that means absolutely nothing, because there's no timeline attached to it. Was she going to tell me that week, that year, after Desmond decided he wanted her? Or only if I found out first? The conversation that followed was 2 hours long, and I'm not going to walk you through every minute of it, because honestly, most of it was just her explaining, and me realizing that every explanation was really just a justification. She said she felt like she'd lost herself in our marriage. She said I worked too much, which, sure, maybe I did, but I was working for us, for the house, for the future she was already quietly abandoning while I clocked overtime to pay for it. She said Desmond made her feel seen, which is a phrase I've come to despise, because it's the kind of thing people say when they want credit for an emotional need without admitting the physical betrayal that came with meeting it. I asked her the only question that actually mattered to me at that point. I asked if it was over with him. She didn't answer right away, and that silence told me everything her words hadn't. It wasn't over. It had never really been on hold. It had just been careful. I moved into my brother's guest room 3 days later, filed for divorce within the month, and here's where the story stops being just about heartbreak and starts being about money, because Renata, it turned out, was a lot smarter about the legal side of things than I gave her credit for. She'd hired a lawyer months before I even knew anything was wrong. A good one. While I was scrambling to find representation and still processing the fact that my marriage was over, she was already 3 steps ahead, positioning herself for the divorce she'd apparently been planning since around the time that spreadsheet started. I won't bore you with every legal detail, but here's the short version. Because of how our finances have been structured, because of some decisions I had made years earlier trying to be generous and put things in both our names without really thinking it through, and because I didn't fight hard enough in those first raw, gutted weeks when I could barely function, let alone strategize, I ended up walking away with almost nothing. The house went to her because she argued successfully that she needed stability and I could start fresh. The savings account, the real one, the one we'd built together over 6 years, got split in a way that somehow left her with more, thanks to some clever framing about who had contributed what over the years, using numbers that weren't exactly lies but weren't exactly the full truth either. Even the car, my car, the one I drove to work every day, ended up being sold as part of settling shared debt that, as I later pieced together, existed partly because of some of those quiet transfers she'd made to Desmond over the months before I found out. If you're keeping score, by the time the ink dried on that divorce, I had lost my house, my car, and most of my savings to a woman who had cheated on me and then outlawyered me on the way out the door. I remember sitting in my brother's guest room that night, And I want to be honest with you about where my head was, because I think it's important, especially if you're watching this and you're somewhere in the middle of your own version of this story. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't plotting anything clever. I was just tired. Bone tired. In a way that sleep doesn't fix. I remember thinking that I had done everything right. Worked hard and faithful, tried to build something good. And somehow I'd ended up with nothing to show for it except an empty bank account and a signature on a piece of paper that legally ended 13 years of my life. There's a version of this story where I spiral from here, where I drink too much, or I stop showing up to work, or I spend the next year stewing in bitterness. I won't lie to you, there were weeks where that felt like exactly where I was headed. But something shifted for me, and I want to try to explain it as honestly as I can, because I think it's the actual heart of this whole story. About 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I was cleaning out a storage unit, going through boxes of things from the house that I'd never bothered to sort, and I found an old notebook from years earlier, back before Renata. Actually, back when I was 26 and broke and living in a studio apartment, dreaming about starting a small equipment repair business. I used to fix things, small engines, generators, that kind of thing, as a side hustle, and I'd written down this whole plan for turning it into something real. I never did it because I met Renata not long after, and life just sort of took over, the way it does, and the notebook got packed away and forgotten. Reading through those old pages in my brother's guest room, with basically nothing left to my name, something clicked. I hadn't just lost a marriage. I'd lost a version of myself that had been slowly buried under 13 years of trying to be exactly what someone else needed me to be, while quietly setting aside everything I'd actually wanted for myself. So I did something that probably sounds small, but it changed everything. I dug out my old tools, the ones that had survived the divorce because Renata never wanted them and nobody got to fight over a box of wrenches and a used generator. And I started fixing things again. First for neighbors, then for a guy at work who needed his lawnmower running before spring. Then word spread, the way it does in small towns, and by the end of that first year, I had more weekend work than I could handle alone. I want to be clear. This wasn't some overnight miracle. I was still living in a spare room. I was still eating a lot of instant noodles. There were nights I sat in my truck. Well, my brother's truck, since I didn't have one of my own yet, and just felt the weight of everything I'd lost. But there was something different now. Something Renata's lawyer couldn't touch. Something no settlement could take from me. Because it was being built after the divorce, not before it. It was mine in a way. The house and the savings account had never really felt like mine, because those had always been ours. And ours turned out to mean whatever a judge decided it meant. 2 years in, I had a small shop. Nothing fancy, a rented space with a metal roof that leaked when it rained hard, but it had my name on the sign, and every tool inside it. I had earned back myself dollar by dollar after starting from zero. Now here's where the story catches up to that party you saw mentioned in the title, because I know some of you have been waiting for it. 3 years after the divorce, I got invited to an industry mixer, a small business networking thing, held at this fairly upscale venue downtown, the kind of place with a string quartet and those little appetizers that never actually fill you up. I almost didn't go. I'm not really the mixer kind of person, but a supplier I worked with had insisted, said there'd be some good contacts there. So I put on the one decent jacket I owned and showed up. I saw her before she saw me. Renata standing near the bar in a dress the color of dusk, laughing at something someone said, looking exactly like the woman I used to come home to. Except now that image didn't do anything to me anymore. That's the strange thing about time and distance. The wounds that once felt like they'd never close eventually just become scars, and scars don't ache away, open wounds do. Then she turned, and our eyes met across the room, and I watched her whole expression change in real time. I want to describe this carefully, because it was one of those moments that felt almost cinematic, except it was just my actual life happening in front of me. She excused herself from the group she was with and walked over, and I could see her doing that thing people do when they are trying to look composed while their brain is scrambling. She stopped a few feet away, and her eyes went from my face to my jacket, which, by the way, was tailored because business had been good, down to the watch on my wrist, which I'd bought myself the year before as a reminder of how far I'd come, and then back up to my face. "You look," she started and then stopped, like she couldn't find the version of the sentence that made sense to her. I asked how she'd been. "The way you do when you're being polite to someone you used to build a life with," she said. "Fine. Good, busy, the usual small talk words that don't actually mean anything." And then, almost like she couldn't help herself, she asked what I was doing there. At that particular event, with those particular people. I told her, plainly, that my company had grown enough over the past couple of years that we'd started getting contracts with a few of the businesses in that room, including, as it turned out, one connected to the very company she now worked for. I watched her face fall in real time, the exact expression from that image. The exact moment everything shifted for her. Because here's what she hadn't known, what nobody in that room really knew except my accountant, and me, the small repair guy she'd left with almost nothing 3 years earlier, now employed 11 people, had 3 trucks with his company's logo on the side, and had just closed a contract that quarter that was worth more than the house she'd fought so hard to keep in the divorce. I'm not telling you this to brag. And honestly, in a moment, I didn't feel triumphant the way you might expect. I felt something quieter, something closer to peace. Because the twist of this whole story isn't really that I got rich and she didn't. Life's not that simple, and honestly, she was doing fine for herself too, from what I'd gathered. The real twist is what she said next. Standing there in that dress, in that room full of soft lighting and clinking glasses, she asked if Desmond and I had ever met. I told her I didn't think so. And then she told me, almost like she needed someone to know, that Desmond had left her about a year after our divorce finalized, for someone even younger, someone from his new job. She said it lightly, like it was old news she'd made peace with, but there was something underneath it. Some old bruise she was still touching, just to check if it still hurt. I didn't feel vindicated hearing that. I want to be honest about that too, because I think revenge stories usually end with the wronged party feeling this huge surge of satisfaction. And that's just not what happened for me. What I actually felt was distance, like I was hearing about the struggles of someone I used to know a long time ago. Someone whose choices no longer had any power over my life. She asked, quietly, almost like she was afraid of the answer, whether I was happy, and I told her the truth. I told her that losing the house, the car, and the savings had been the worst thing that had ever happened to me, and also, somehow, the thing that finally forced me to build a life that was actually mine, instead of one I'd half inherited from a version of myself that had stopped asking what he actually wanted a long time ago. I told her I was happy, not because of the money, though the money certainly didn't hurt after years of counting every dollar. Happy because for the first time in over a decade, nothing in my life existed because someone else needed it to. The shop, the trucks, the crew who showed up every morning and called it our business, all of it was something I had built with my own 2 hands, starting from absolute zero, on the floor of an empty house with no furniture left in it. She nodded, said she was glad, and there was something genuine in it, underneath the awkwardness of the moment. We didn't hug. We didn't exchange numbers or promise to catch up sometime. The way people say they will and never do. She went back to her group near the bar, and I found my supplier a friend and spent the rest of the night actually enjoying myself, talking business, making real connections, existing fully in a life that had nothing to do with her anymore. I think about that notebook sometimes, the one I found in the storage unit. The one with all those old dreams from when I was 26 and broke and hopeful in a completely different way than I am now. I think about how strange it is that losing everything was actually what led me back to it. If Renata had never cheated, if I'd never found that spreadsheet, I probably would have spent the rest of my life slowly disappearing into a marriage that was already quietly ending without me knowing it, and I never would have gone looking for that old version of myself again. I'm not saying I'm grateful for what happened. I don't think gratitude is really the right word for betrayal, but I've stopped being angry about it. And that took a long time to get to, longer than I think people expect when they hear stories like this. It wasn't an overnight forgiveness. It was years of slowly filling my life back up with things that were mine, until one day I looked around and realized the bitterness had just quietly moved out, the same way she once did, except this time I didn't even notice it leaving until it was already gone. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, it's that the things people take from you, the house, the car, the money, the years, those are real losses, and I'm not going to pretend they don't hurt, because they absolutely do. But there's a difference between what someone can take from you in a courtroom and what you're capable of building afterward, on your own terms, with your own hands. Nobody can subpoena that. Nobody's lawyer can argue that away in a settlement. Renata got the house. She got the car. For a while. She even got most of the money. But she never got the thing that actually mattered in the end, because that thing didn't exist yet when we split. I built it after, alone, from nothing, in a rented shop with a leaky roof, and it turned out to be worth more than everything she walked away with combined. That's the part she could never take. And honestly, looking back now, I think that's the part that was never really hers to take in the first place.